I appreciate your time today, so let me get to it. Before I even introduce myself, there is one thing I need everybody to be on the same page about, which is just setting the tone. This is a collective learning space, right? That's like what For Keeps always is, but the nature of what we're talking about today is also an idea that's still being developed and will only get better and be refined by your willingness to seek clarity and ask questions. All right, we already had our collective learning agreement, but to introduce myself, my name is Kennedy Arnette Mitchell. I'm gonna say my full name for them folks. And today we're going to be talking about how to create living archives. And it's kind of a expansive topic, but we're going to try and break it down into things that are actionable and within our wheelhouse now, things that we can start doing with what we have. A few things I think you should know about me as your facilitator.
Oh my God.
Here are my qualifications. I love my grannies. That's a very deep well for me. And I also learn a lot from them. So my relationship with my elders is one of those things that I felt important to note. I enjoy a good puzzle. I be geeked up. I like problem solving. I'm studying design, and it kind of just leads me into different things. So that's kind of how I got into this work, feeling so deeply like I do about my family and just being like nosy and curious. Like, look at this child. This child has always been in grown folks' business. Those are two things that kind of lend to the third point, which is just that I'm the type to frame the puzzle when I finish it. I feel like I take extra care in the process of figuring something out and the questions that I'm willing to ask, because I know that on the other side of it, when I do kind of get to that kind of solution or resolved place, even if it's not, most of the questions don't have a singular answer. But I take extra care in the process because I know it's going to end up being something beautiful, and also for the next person, it makes it a little bit easier on them to have that experience. So that's the approach that I take when I am figuring out the archives that I've inherited from my elders. All these years that I've been asking questions and like begging up on information from my elders who did not want to say anything really for their own reasons, they gradually opened up, or I kind of just was able to get certain pieces of information, and now they're at that point in their lives where they're willingly giving me their photo albums, and they're telling me things that they might not have told me before, or I'm uncovering them in these really serendipitous ways. And so the reason I think that these are like my greatest credibility points is just because somebody's already entrusted me to do this work, and I take it with great care. So that being said, I have a similar dilemma to what many of you guys described, and I'm going to use my family archives as a way to break down what this archival method is. Even if you have an interest in preserving something that's more present and future oriented, this still applies, but I think it's kind of like tackling the biggest questions we have allows us to break it down into smaller pieces and make something of that. So I'm inheriting fragmented memories. I have never the full story. I have kind of just bits and pieces. It's not really organized with like a certain structure. It was just kind of done for enjoyment and care, which is a valid form in itself. Aging and fragile, tangible artifacts like the photo albums, they're kind of like hard to peel out of the albums that I've inherited. And I don't always have so many tools and resources that I feel are available to me to kind of like propel this practice. The stories themselves are difficult to trace because the nature of what we're talking about often is a personal history. There's a reason that your story might not find significance or be harder to trace in some database that doesn't really like see you to begin with. So what I try to preserve in this whole process is the intention that went into creating the artifact or holding on to it for this long. Because what happens with these things is like most of the time it's not actually that someone see such value in it when they maybe take the photo or when they choose to hold on to the artifact until it's like all crinkled up and cool looking and you're like, oh my God, this is now like super rare. It's just trying to kind of investigate the feeling that held on to it for that long, the feeling that captured it in the first place. So the pattern I noticed in a lot of the questions that you guys had as far as figuring out your own practice is how easy it is to kind of go into that space of lack where you're thinking immediately about what you don't have. You're trying to organize your archives, you're trying to create some sort of structure, and whether it's in your personal resources or in some sort of institutional resource, you're feeling limited. And so that's like kind of where we get stuck before we can even begin sometimes. It's like, oh, I don't have a $1,000 scanner and a way to restore these images and a this and a that, and I definitely don't have an endless amount of time to do all of these things. But I want to kind of use that to our advantage, to kind of turn that and flip it on its head. The idea of like starting with the negative, starting with the thing that we don't have. So in my instance, I'm talking about how I have all of these family archives, these I have 3 that I just inherited from one of my grandmothers, and they're just like 3-inch thick binders. Oh man, it's photos from the 18-somethings to like 2013. How am I supposed to pull this together and find a through line there? But I'm starting with my questions. I'm starting with what I can surmise, what I can infer. Even just being in that space where I'm starting with like noticing the lack, noticing those questions, it led me to kind of break it down into 2 separate spheres of what I want out of the current value system, or like the new value system that I'm setting with this archival method, and that you guys can kind of surmise for yourselves. Imperial versus of the people. We're gonna pitch it like this. Imperial archives are often the ones that we encounter the most limitations in. Imperial archives are voyeuristic. They offer singular categories and definitions. They're rigid in their categories and how they are able to kind of describe or even see us. And they're also just, I think what comes to mind when we start to think that way is a sort of stagnancy. But I do want to note that the reason I put the language as imperial rather than just like blanket institution is because archives, although they kind of were a practice that was born at the same time that we started like creating the science of history and all of these other things to kind of delegitimize certain people's identities, namely Black and Indigenous people, I want to separate it from certain folks who have honed in on those methods to do good work. There's like a story that I had heard recently about the New York Library and how they, within a span of maybe 5 years, they changed their categorizing method over 100 times. Because it's constantly evolving. They're getting new information, new factors, and things of that nature. And so when I think about not just what works in a functional sense for the larger scale operations like a library, but the values that I hold, I need my archives and the archives that actually have the capacity to show and preserve care the way I intend. I need my archives to be embodied. I need my archives to be dynamic in nature, allowing for multiple truths to exist at once. I need my archives to be open-ended so that I can revisit as I develop my questions, and it may lead me not to a finite answer, but to more questions. And I also want my archives to be time resistant. So something that we'll often encounter in this space is how do these things age and what value do they hold as they age? Does it decline in some ways and does it strengthen in others or gain importance in other ways? But what remains true of both of these, the imperial versus the kind of the people model, these value systems, is that archives just exist to preserve and allow access over time. When I say accessibility over time, I'm thinking about 2 generations removed. If I sorted through and reworked my family archives, and I'm not there to provide context for the structure that I made, are they still able to interpret it? Does it still hold some sort of value to them, even if it's not the same value that I initially kind of was operating around? Then how archives serve that function is by description, arrangement, and one that I want us to consider more heavily, engagement. Description is basically just the known context and terms that you use to lend to the image. Basically, it's just what we're working with when we can like kind of draw out the details of an image. So let's do a little refresh over what arrangement is. Arrangement is kind of the visual context that your archive exists in rather than the textual context, which we just played with. So for the visual context, a lot of the connections that we made by thinking through the story link, we already might be able to access when we are seeing the images laid out a certain way together. And this can include like how it looks on a singular page, or if you're archiving something other than images, say you have like different kinds of media, you can also create your categories based on the context that you want to kind of naturally show up in this way. And when I say naturally, I just mean like, again, the work that you do, how would someone without you to give definition to it, how would they experience it differently, and how much of your intention, your original intention, can be preserved even if you're not there to kind of explain yourself. So that is like, arrangement is organization. Some examples from what I've been encountering when I'm working with my grandmother's photo album. Pages like this are photos that I think of as the most vulnerable. What makes these photos so vulnerable on their own or in this kind of separate context is that they're increasingly likely to be without the kind of original like context clues that you could use to draw out some of the hidden meaning of these photos. Thankfully, I can kind of like still play with certain parts of it, but what happens when your elders are not there for you to ask, or they don't remember, or these people in the photos, they don't recognize the other people, but they, you know, it's just so increasingly apart, not just apart from like the other context on the page that could support it, but it's also like increasingly apart from the things that help us summon that memory back up. But there are also pages like this, and this is what led me to make the choice to just scan everything as is, instead of pulling out all of the photos individually at first. My current strategy is just to scan it, so when I turn through it, it's almost like you're turning the pages yourself. That's as my grandma left it. I'm going to still scan. I have started scanning these photos individually, but they offer a much different feeling alone. On the page, you get the whole party. You get that this child loves her father. I get that, oh my God, that was my dad. I didn't know he was so petite. And you know, like folks who have passed are in these photos. Children who are my elders are in these photos. Again, I wasn't even thought of, but I'm still like drawing upon certain parts of the feeling in this room. And so one thing I like to think about when I'm arranging is the idea of like creating a room with your image. But as it was, how the original person, my grandmother, put these things in a photo album, I got a decent story to work with because of how she laid certain pieces out on the page. The archival live method functions on these values. It's, yes, the things we talked about before, but it's these three core values that make it a reparative ethics effort, which is, one, the idea that memory is alive. And so our archives also have to be using the qualities of liveness to revisit, reimagine, and reorient. So just constantly moving through and repositioning ourselves as we acquire new information, have new experiences. When I say alive, I mean subject to change and always having to like respond to some sort of new information or stimuli. So to me, that's the quality of liveness that I want in my archives, even if they don't, you know, respire or reproduce in the same way we tend to think of life in our own image. But memory and the nature of how we work through things, memory as a process of learning and reflection, is always drawing upon what we previously knew. So, and making it, it's reworking it. So every time you remember something, you're not actually going back to the original experience, as objective as you might think you are. When you remember something, you're remembering, your mind is latching onto the last time that you remembered it. It's pulling that and then adding the new information, the new context, insight that you might have. So even though the memories are inherently of the past, it's never singular in that sense. It's never like finite or fixed in one particular point in time, because our ability to engage with it is present oriented. Number 2, just the idea that cultural artifacts are best preserved using the strategies of their cultural creators. For Black and Indigenous traditions specifically, we tend to think of ourselves as coming from oral traditions, but I think that's one dimension of it. It's not to be understated, because a story can outlive a tangible photo somehow. It's going to change just like a memory would from person to person, but a story is one half of it. What accompanies the story that we don't often kind of make that connection, I think, is that even going back to like African traditions, it's oral visual culture. You have a story, but with it you have a performance, you have a ritual, you have a mask, you have something that's kind of like engaging you in it. And that itself lends to the third point, which is that no matter what artifact, no matter what the tangible thing that you're working with is, memories are images. So when we start thinking about how we want to build out our archives, even if it's text or different kinds of, I guess, audio libraries, videos, what have you, still what we're trying to get at is rebuilding and adding new texture and dimension to the image of the memory itself. Part of the flipping from the question or the unknown to the known allows us to use the process where we're moving from the image to the meaning rather than the reverse. Sometimes we'll have a photo right in front of us and we'll be like, well, where's the information to tell me what this photo is worth or the value in this image? And instead of immediately kind of outsourcing the care or intention of that, seeing where our personal values can be inserted into that process, especially like a way older artifact, like something that's like a photo of my grandma's grandma, who I didn't get to know in life, right? Although I can have reverence for the fact that it's really old and must have meant something to a lot of people to still like be here in a physical form, what's going to allow it to be retained in the future is partly how I insert myself into that memory. I am one person who's handing it off or touching it at some point to kind of work towards the preservation of it. So why not in my description or how I choose to kind of organize this image, insert what my personal like attachment to or significance is to this image. You have to have some sort of like meaningful and significant connection to this memory, to the thing that you're trying to retain, because otherwise your brain will literally discard it. Our minds are not actually meant to hold every single piece of information forever. And so that's part of why we're outsourcing it. That's part of why we want some sort of external structure to kind of set us up with that. So those are the main 3 that I like try and always kind of revisit when I'm thinking about how I want to structure my ideas, bless you. And these values is just, I want it to be agile. I want it to use the same tools or strategies that created it. And I also am viewing whatever artifact I'm working with as an image itself. Any questions before we go further? Feeling that? Okay. So, because it is a living thing, it's a practice. It's not just a one-off. But I think that also can come as a relief. so that you're not really just trying to like all of a sudden apply some rigid or strict structure to your life. You're able to actually kind of sit with it and gradually revisit it. So what Archival Live supports is and encourages when developing your archives is creative thinking in ordered structure. That can be intuitive, it can be playful. It's also rooted in the oral visual tradition that I just described, so kind of thinking about it twofold. It's modeled after cognitive memory in the sense that it is constantly being adapted as we get new information, and also our learning is enhanced by the experience and the significance that it holds to us. So we're gonna play with description in an exercise I like to call restorative description. Has anyone heard of reparative description before? No? Okay, so like reparative description is the term that they use reparative description is like the process of correcting history that's been organized with outdated like terms, usually slurs, like, or derogatory terms. So it's like, if somebody has a whole like archive of Black history, but it's under some term that we would never think to look up for as Black people now, we're gonna have to reorganize that so that it is more presently reflective of the current like values and what's appropriate. So that's what reparative description is. And I think that speaks to kind of like part of the institutional and imperial standard that we kind of are working against, which is just the idea that like it was never designed to truly see us, to represent us in any way. So the categories that are constructed are often dehumanizing or very impersonal. That's where we get that kind of voyeuristic feeling, right? Like you have your history or so much Black history in certain museums and spaces of that nature, but the way that it's being engaged with is so othering. It's so apart from how you live your life and how these people probably created these memories. So what we're doing in this exercise is we're going to be making intuitive inferences to connect a story between the two images that you guys brought with you today, if you have them. I also have images that I can share.
Okay, so I feel like you gave the description or the definition for reparative, but did you give them for restorative?
Oh, no, thank you for catching my brain. So what we're trying to restore and what I'm after when I work with this kind of exercise, I'm trying to restore something about the original intention, something about the inner world of the person who created it or who is in the photo. I think where I draw the distinction is just that reparative is kind of like if your car is a hoopty and another check engine light comes on, you're gonna, I guess, keep putting money into it so you can keep going where you need to go, but ultimately you know you're not gonna like be in that car forever. You're gonna have to like invest in a new car that's gonna last you or get you where you really need to go. So restorative to me is kind of like beginning to build out that new value system. Reparative is kind of like correcting and hoping it can fit into the old way in some sort of adapted sense. Does that answer your question? Okay. Any other questions before we get started? I'm gonna give you some instructions. What you'll see on the worksheet is a place for two images. And we're gonna try and work our way through as if it's like a competition board, right? We're gonna try and narrow the connection between them to a shared story. We're gonna work from the center out in my explanation, but the exercise itself is starting with each image on its own, and then you're gonna come together in the meaning. So the story link itself, why it says identity underneath it, is because this is where you're gonna be inserting yourself. This is where I wanna hear what the significance of these shared photos is for you. So we're starting with an image. Who, what, when, where. You do not actually have to have all of that information. You don't. But I just want you to practice that muscle of just giving yourself something. Like, don't leave anything blank. And even if there's a way that you would kind of want to continue your search in explaining or like investigating this image, you can offer yourself a question to revisit later. Okay? That's part of why we're even able to have conversations like this today, part of why the culture is so rich in itself, because we are intuitively knowing things that we're working our way back to in the world. And so how we structure and live our daily lives, how we move through our ideas, is just one way that we can use that presence and embody the kind of tradition of storytelling and all these different things that are present in our memories and our sense of identity. Because that's like, it's just the idea that all the different pieces in you are enough to make something of. So I will leave you with that, and I hope that you guys also have a moment to linger after and maybe connect with somebody, because I might not have the most knowledge on, say, like a certain kind of image preservation, but the person you were sitting next to was a photographer, you know? Please exchange information and skills with you guys, with each other, so that way you can just keep up and kind of expand your toolkit. And I really just appreciate you guys being here today. Thank you so much for your time and your willingness. Thank you guys. Ooh.